Good. Okay. That's not.
Good morning, everyone. It looks like we're ready to start with the vulnerable person abuse prevention policy orientation. It's almost a tongue twister, but let's see how we can get through the presentation. We'll do the presentation in English. Not a lot of it is in Afrikaans, so I guess the slide will be the only one that's partially in Afrikaans. Met die kwesbare persoon mishandeling voorkomingsbeleid van die Uniese bedryfsbeleid, or the SAU working policy, is actually behind this. But let's start with a short focus on scripture before we delve into it. Maybe we can have a prayer, and then I would like to actually get into the technicalities of our topic. Maybe let's pray and ask God to be with us as we open His Word. Father, we are thankful for your protection. Thank you for granting us life. And as we discuss this very important topic, I pray that you will bless us, that you will grant us your wisdom. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. And so we read in Matthew 18 from verse 1 to 7. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And he called a child to himself and set him before them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like little children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for them to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks will come, but woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes." And I think this is probably very pertinent when we deal with abuse, especially child abuse in the church, because I think that will be quite a stumbling block, or is quite a stumbling block for children and in their spiritual walk and the relationship with the Lord. And so I think Scripture issues a stern warning, but it doesn't stop with Scripture and our duty towards the vulnerable. But we also have, I think, legislation which we will talk about to say that we really need to care for vulnerable in the society. And the children, although the Lord treasure them and they are very precious to the Lord, should also be precious to us, and we should protect their safety. And that's really what our presentation will be all about this morning. And so I've divided it in merely 2 stages. I think the advertisement talk about 3 stages, but we'll really try and narrow it down to 2 stages. And the first one, or the first part, I would like to talk about reporting over investigating, as there's often a misunderstanding when we talk about child sexual abuse or vulnerable person abuse. There's confusion about the matter of reporting versus investigating. So I would like to spend some time with that. And this duty, pardon me, is for church officers, for church members, and also for citizens of South Africa. And I will explain to you why we're all included in this duty of reporting, especially mandatory reporting. And so the South African Union Conference has a working policy, and this policy is one of the latest editions. It came out in, I think, 2018, 2019, if I recall correctly, and it is listed in the policy book as M, Vulnerable Person Abuse Prevention Policy. And just as the church manual, for those who are interested, they also have editions. And so we always use the latest edition. And to my knowledge, Pastor Greg, I'm not sure whether they've issued a new one, but I think this is the latest edition of the SAU working policy. So when we refer to the policy, as with the church manual, we always look at the latest dated one. We don't use previous versions, as they could be not corrupted, but just outdated. Okay, so let's start then with the policy framework. I will also go to legislation, and because I'm starting with the legislation, I will move to the policy. I'm not going to go to it in detail. I didn't think that was necessarily the purpose of our presentation, but let's see how we do. If you have any questions, maybe we could reserve them for the end. Maybe I might answer your question as we go on. If not, if you reserve your questions for the end, I'll be happy to entertain the questions. You'll ask the questions, and I'll ask Pastor Donovan to answer them. Okay, there we go. And so we will refer to other legislation as well, but the Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Related Matters Act, number 32 of 2007 is the most important one. And it says in Article 54 that there's an obligation to report commission of sexual offences against children or persons who are mentally disabled. And so it means that we have a duty. It is mandatory. So if an act of sexual offence against children or people who are mentally disabled takes place, we have a duty to report such a offence. And then it'll go out as to how, and there's a procedure. But I want you to note that it is in the criminal law, which means if you do not do this, you're actually breaking the law. But we'll get to that shortly. Then if you continue with Article 54, it says in subsection 1A, a person who has knowledge that a sexual offence has been committed against a child must report such knowledge immediately to a police official. And that is really what it is saying. In other words, you don't really have a choice. And you can see in the definition, a person. It is very, very, very wide. In Afrikaans, we would have said, so wyd soos die Here se genade. This includes almost everyone. And that's why I started off the section by saying, it includes church officers, church members, and citizens of South Africa, because we have to abide to the law. So if you have knowledge, if you became aware that a child has been abused, and especially a sexual offense has been committed against a child, you must report. And that's why we use the term, it's mandatory reportable. And then it says immediately. In other words, the timing since you learned about the sexual offense and when you actually report it becomes important, because that in itself can become a criminal offense. And it says you must report it to a police official. And I will comment on this a little bit later, what happens if we don't, and the risk we expose ourselves to as a church. But the law is very, very clear as to what should happen when we have knowledge that a child or a sexual offense has been committed against a child. Now, I'm not going to take the time in this presentation, and similar presentations, I've actually done that, but the law defines a child. We'll talk about that later. Even the policy definition, that's any person under the age of 18 in South Africa is a child currently. The sexual offenses, there's a whole list of what the law understands to be a sexual offense. And so it's important then when we deal with this and with legislation that it is not your definition or your perception of what a sexual offense is. And by the way, one of the subsections in the law says mouth-to-mouth contact between two people, and the one person is under the age of 18 amounts to a sexual offense committed against a child. So I mean, I'm not saying that, but the law is describing that, and it looks like if a person kisses a child who is under the age of 18, it could be construed as a criminal offense according to the Act. Now, I know that it is a little bit more complicated than that, and that's why we talk about reporting. And investigation is something very, very different. And people who investigate this, the social workers, the people with the knowledge, and the social workers, even in the police, they will respond appropriately. But it does not remove or negate the fact that we need to report it. We sort of asked that we have the questions at the end, but then take that question quickly. No, I'll take that question.
So if both parties are under the age of 18 and they're kissing,
it's still a criminal offense. Because that's what the Act is saying. So how they respond to it is something very, very different. Yeah. But let's not go into that detail. And I know I'm going to open it up, and that's why I didn't even want to go there, because that's what happened in previous presentations, because people have all sorts of questions. But it is true, and it depends on the circumstances. So they will look at whether there was consent, whether the one person was coerced, and so they will take things like that into account. And obviously, if it's a first offense, and all sorts of things. And that's why I said, when it comes to investigating it's one matter. But it doesn't change the fact of reporting. Now, what I'm saying as well is, you don't decide what is a sexual offense according to the Act. The Act describes it. Now, I'm not even going to go there. I will make a recommendation at the end, Pastor Donovan, that maybe you must send the appropriate acts to the people that they can read for themselves, because surely we will not have time to go into all the detail in a presentation like this. Okay. Now, I want to go on, and a person who fails to report such knowledge as contemplated in paragraph A is guilty of an offense and is liable on conviction to a fine or to imprisonment of a period not exceeding 5 years, or to both a fine and such imprisonment. So this is really a very, very serious matter not to report. Now, the challenge from the church's point of view is that we are an organization. And so often people will press criminal charges, that's the one thing, but they place civil litigation to claim damages for our failure or neglect to report. And because we are a world organization, some people take that opportunity to sue the organization. And there's a lot of money and a lot of heartache involved in matters like this. So it is really important that we understand that when there's a mandatory reportable matter, that mandatory reportable matter is reported to the appropriate authorities because of the complications. Now, often, especially in my current function as in the HR, where we deal with a lot of legal matters and all sorts of other principles, our philosophy with Secretariat at the moment, that's the Executive Secretary and the department in which I'm working, is that we do the right thing, because it is the right thing to do. So firstly, we are disciples of Jesus, and we do the right thing not because we are afraid of the consequences of breaking some law made by man. We try to do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. And I think that should be also our starting point when we look at this policy, to say, we do what is right to do to protect the vulnerable because that is the right thing to do. Not because we're fearful of the consequences, but it doesn't take away that there can be severe consequences, financial consequences, even imprisonment, if one doesn't attend to some of this. Having said that, the law also continues to say that a person who in good faith reports such reasonable belief or suspicion shall not be liable to any civil or criminal proceedings by reason of making such report. Now, just one or two things. So if you report, if you learned about this and you make the report, what this section is saying of the article is that nothing can happen to you if you do it in good faith. Then they can't either criminally or civilly litigate against you for making such a report. However, if that report has been made not in good faith, this article will not protect you. And so sometimes in divorce proceedings and other similar matters, we find that people are making accusations, causing smoke when there's no real fire. Now, if it is found that you've made such unwarranted claims, you could be in trouble. However, if you become aware and you act in good faith, the law will protect you. Does it make sense? So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is I'm just going to focus, the policy is available, and I'm sure Pastor Donovan will circulate it again. And the aim is not to read the whole policy, but I will stop at one or two of the main sections of this. So we've established that according to legislation, it is important that certain matters be reported, which are mandatory reportable matters. And because of that, and the church didn't have a policy prior to this, we currently have that policy in. And so the policy starts with an introduction, and it says the restoration of mankind into the image of God is the central theme of the story of redemption. And therefore, it is not only a duty of the church, but also an honor to protect and advance the safety and security of the weak and the vulnerable. But not only attempting at establishing a safe and secure church environment, but also by creating standards aimed at their protection. And that's really why we have this type of presentation and why this policy exists. We support the legal, as a church, it continues, it says, we support the legal and social processes which are aimed at preventing these atrocities. In our support of these governmental goals, our responsibility is not only to report any such occurrences that as a church we might become aware, but also to actively pursue preventative measures in order to make our churches and institutions a place of safety and healing. And I thought that was a very important introduction. It sort of helped us understand where the church is from and what is the church's position in regard to this. We also know that there are other denominations and church groups who actually are very quiet and actually do a lot to prevent the reporting and the investigating of this type of atrocities mentioned. So let it be far from us to hide it, but to rather aim at having our churches and institutions a place of safety and healing. And unfortunately, these atrocities doesn't just happen out in the world. It happens in our church, in our conference. There were instances even in this very congregation where similar instances took place, and when we had to respond to that, or the church had to respond to that. And so it's not something that we read about and hear out there. It is something that is really affecting the very fiber of our society and our religious experience, even in the day in which we live. And so the objective of this policy is to ensure that all forms of abuse and violence, which carries a mandatory reporting. Now, I'll just take you briefly through what those offenses are and some of the legislation involved. But so that all forms of abuse and violence, which carries a mandatory reporting requirement in terms of the national legislation, be reported immediately and effectively to the relevant authorities in order to combat sexual offenses and other forms of abuse in the church. And so what this is saying is certain offenses, according to certain acts and legislation, carry a mandatory. In other words, we have to report them. Some we report them to social workers, some we report to police officials, and but that we as a church organization ensure that we comply with these rules and regulations when we are aware of an incident, of a reportable instance. So this policy also aims to ensure that proper record-keeping mechanisms are in place in order to ensure that all information pertaining to reported incidents are safely kept in order to ensure accountability and organizational credibility. And this is really very, very important. Often we don't know, and there are other individuals involved, other role players. Once we reported the South African police, for instance, and we as a conference, the Cape Conference had a very unfortunate experience where a child sexual abuse matter was reported, and allegedly some of the family members were of the opinion that we didn't follow the national legislation, and it turned into litigation. It was very expensive for both the church and even the individual, I would presume. And there are no winners in litigation. You struggle. And so it seems that when you consider litigation like this and you look at the facts, one of the important things is whether you can defend your position. And I had a little story I wanted to tell you about this. Maybe I should do this quickly. My dad was a police officer. He passed away in 94, 95. It's a long lifetime ago, I guess. And I recall when I was still in high school, probably standard 9, would it be grade 11, that they were involved in some incidents. We stayed at a small little town, and he was a police officer there, and they arrested a couple. It looks like the young man who was driving the vehicle had some dacha in the vehicle, so they arrested him, and because of that, they confiscated the vehicle. But apparently, they laid no charges against his fiancée, who was also in the vehicle. But being a one-horse town, not a lot happening, and she was on her way to a major city. And so my dad brought her after the police station closed, because in those, when it becomes dark, they roll up the tar roads and switch on the lights. It's a small little town, nothing happens. So he invited her to our house. My mother prepared a meal for her. And then there was one train that came to and from the town every night at about 12 o'clock. And so the idea was then that he would take her to the station, and I think they bought her a ticket, and on the way she was. And so she had a meal with us, and we all were resting, and we were in bed already. And so at the appropriate time, my dad woke up, my mum woke him up so that they can take her to the station. And my mum said to him, "You must take one of the boys with." And my dad said, "No, they are sleeping." My mum said, "Take one of the boys with." I was the lucky winner to be woken up. And I remember going with my dad, and I couldn't understand why I had to wake up that unearthly hour of the day to go with my dad. Anyway, we took her to the station, and we saw off, and she was on the train, and she went away. And it wasn't 2-3 weeks later, my dad was called in, and his commanding officer said to him that allegedly he raped this young woman. And if they let the charges go against the gentleman, they will let the charges go against my dad. And so my dad said to his commanding officer that it's very strange that he would rape this woman in front of his boy, because they neglected to tell that I was there all the time. Now, what I've learned from that experience many, many years ago is that you never put yourself in a situation that you cannot defend. And it was something that sort of guides my whole path. I've been involved with ministry, pastoral ministry, and I'm not saying I'm perfect and did everything right, but I try to make sure that I don't find myself in a situation which I cannot explain. And when you deal with this type of policy and reporting it, you need to be very, very sure that if you ask an explanation, that you will be able to defend your position. Because that is what often happens. And these things are highly emotional, and people are offended and hurt when an incident like especially child sexual abuse takes place, and people are very angry, and they will go at all lengths to try and protect a position. And so if it sounds like you didn't do due diligence, you didn't report the matter, and you can't prove. Now the challenge with this is, and I'm not bad-mouthing the South African Police Service. They're a system and an organization on their own. But unfortunately, our experience is that when we report a matter, it is not so easy. They don't easily take your report. And so I had a few instances here in Cape Town where I went to several police stations where I had to make a mandatory report. And then the first thing they confuse is they say to me that I can't lay a charge. I say, no, I'm not here to lay a charge. But by the way, I can lay a charge according to the Act, because when you're a pastoral therapist and you deal in that situation, the law would allow you to lay a complaint about on behalf of somebody else. But we're not here to lay a complaint. So it's not even illegal to lay a complaint for certain people. But I'm just making the mandatory report. And they say to me, no, we can't take this report. So then you normally talk to the person at the station, at the desk, the constable, and then I say, well, sort of have a little bit of inside information. So call the sergeant. That's the next rank, And then the sergeant come and tell me the same story. And then I said, no, maybe somebody else need to help me. It's their warrant officer. And so I go up all the ranks until I've exhausted the ranks at the local police station. And then I ask, let me speak to the station commissioner or somebody in charge. And then normally they start developing an appetite to actually take your report. And all they need to do is they need to take your report, they need to record it in an official register of the police station. And it is wise if you make such a report, which is mandatory, and you can get into trouble, serious criminal trouble, that you take a witness with you, that somebody can testify, and make sure that you have paperwork. Always have paperwork, because otherwise you cannot defend that position. But we'll talk about that a little bit later as we move on, and that's why the Form 22 becomes so important in matters like this. Okay, so there are certain acts. I didn't list all of them. I just list some of the important ones that I can think of. Pastor Donovan, maybe we can try and get copies of this. And again, if you Google these, all of these are on the, and if you want the PowerPoint presentation, I can save it and send it to you after the presentation so that you have a copy of that. But if you Google, you can find all these acts in PDF form, and you can download them. So they're fairly freely available. The Children's Act, 38 of 2005. The Children Justice Act, 75 of 2008. The Criminal Law, Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amended Act, 32 of 2007. The Films Publication Act, 65 of 1996. A very interesting one. Often we don't realize that if children are children and they record themselves doing things that children are not supposed to do, and you are in possession of that, they send it on WhatsApp, you could be guilty of this Films and Publication Act of being in possession of pornography even, or some information. People are not always considering that. The Old Person Act, 13 of 2006, which speaks about the abuse of people over the age of, I think, women 60 and gentlemen 65. And they will relate it there. And so what are the actual reportable offenses? Just a summary. We're not going to go into detail. And so child sexual abuse and pornography. And again, the various legislation will define in detail what the legislator understand to be a child sexual abuse. And it includes from kissing, touching, all sorts of things, all the way to pornography. And even elements like rape could be included in there. Then sexual abuse of the mentally disabled, other forms of abuse against children, which is deliberate neglect, and abuse which causes physical injuries. Maybe I know we are recorded, so maybe I shouldn't talk too much about the discipline style when I was growing up. But these days, a lot of that is no longer tolerable or tolerated by the law, and you can actually get yourself into trouble. I was at the shop in the week, and there was a mother. She handed the boy a parcel. He was sitting in the trolley, and she was busy paying, and he dropped the food on the ground, and she was very, very tempted to discipline him right there. But I guess she realized that there's a lot of people in camera, so she expressed her unhappiness, but she didn't get violent, fortunately, at that moment. But it is against the law. Teachers would know that you can no longer have any physical or corporate punishment in schools. It's against the law. It will refer to that. And things like if a child, a person under 18, which is supposed to go to school, doesn't go to school, it's a criminal act, and it should be reported as part of the abuse. And then abuse of the elderly or other abuse that should be reported. And so in terms of our reference, so when we are aware of child sexual abuse or child pornography, sexual abuse of the mentally disabled, if we are aware of abuse against children, where children are neglected, where they're not cared for, where they are abused, which cause physical injuries to them, or abuse against elderly, we are to report those matters according to the policy that we have. That's why the churches have an abuse prevention officer and an abuse prevention committee that needs to deal with this. And again, without spending too much time on this, there's definitions for children. According to South African legislation, any person under the age of 18 is regarded to be a child. To just go back to a previous comment and question, then they will look at the ages as well. So if a child is under the age of 18 and above 16, then there will be a certain, how can I say, response of severity. If the person is under the age of 16 but over 12, there will be a different type of response. And if the child is under the age of 12, obviously it looks like that will be some of the more severe and extreme cases of abuse, and it will be dealt with as far as that is concerned. Then sexual abuse in relation to a child or the mentally disabled, there's definitions for that. Commercial sexual exploitation in relation to a child and the mentally disabled, and pornography. The policy briefly just touches on that, but as I say, it would help to also look at the actual legislation to have an understanding. So it would not be a defense to say, I didn't know, and I have a different opinion than the legislator. Their definition stands, unfortunately. The deliberate neglect in relation to a child or mentally disabled, older person, and abuse in the case of an older person also defined in terms of our policy and framework and what we are supposed to do and our duty as church members, as officers, and as citizens of South Africa. Then on the policy M05-2005, so all the policies are classified. So when you deal with financial policies, they will have an F, for instance, and some others will have a Y, depending on where they are in the policy book. So the M is normally the code, so you can find it in the policy book. And then normally they start with an introduction with policy, would be a zero, and then it moves on in fives. And the subsections of the policy are then the numbers behind. That's where they get the numbers from, if you are interested in that. But the M05-2005 deals with reporting of child sexual abuse, pornography, deliberate neglect, and the physical abuse. A little bit later, I'll just show you a diagram as to how it works, but you can read the detail in there should you be interested. And so the policy 0525 M0525 deals with the abuse prevention official or officer, and that is the person that is supposed to guide and coordinate events that are mandatory reportable if they occur in an entity. So it says all entities must appoint or designate an abuse prevention official. I think Helleberg Church requested me to serve in that capacity. At the conference, if I recall correctly, Jeremy, I've forgotten Jeremy's surname for a second, Jeremy Flotman, he is the abuse prevention official for the conference. And so normally when an incident takes place at the local congregation, you report it to the local abuse prevention official, and we need to then also make sure that there's a report to the conference, and the conference must escalate it up to the union. All entities, I think there's something wrong with the number, but all entities must appoint an abuse prevention committee, which membership comprise of at least all heads of departments dealing with vulnerable groups as described in this policy. So typically you would like to have your children ministries and your Sabbath school division heads or leaders that deals with that to serve on the committee. Probably your pathfinders and your adventurers and those groups as well. The function of this APC will be to assist the APO with his or her functions and duties, and the APO will act as chairperson of this APC or the Abuse Prevention Committee. So if there's an incident of abuse, how should the church respond when the church becomes aware of an incident of abuse? And it seems that the church responds to abuse by the person who becomes aware of the abuse in the church must immediately inform the abuse prevention official. That seems to be the first step. The person must assist the person to report the matter as soon as possible to the appropriate authorities, social worker or police officer, depending on the situation. And I think we've talked about it a little bit earlier, but there's a duty to report, not to investigate. And I think it's very important to understand the difference. A report means we alert the appropriate authorities that an incident took place, and that's our duty. But when it gets to investigation, it's a little bit more complicated, and I didn't want to include it and take a lot of time with this presentation, but there's a lot of literature on the investigation of especially child sexual abuse, and it seems that that is a very, very complicated matter, as it is not so easy to determine. And it seems that the younger that the child is, that is supposedly or apparently abused, the higher the qualifications need to be of the person that's leading the investigation. So you don't want an inexperienced person that is doing the investigation of a very young child, especially a child, say, at the age of 5 or 6 years old, a child even younger. The challenges in trying to investigate when a child doesn't have the vocabulary and cannot express him or herself, and there's not always physical evidence that you can work with, and so forth. That's a one part. So because of that, we do not investigate it. Then there's another challenge with investigation. If we as a church investigate, we've got no powers to investigate. You know, when the government investigate, they can subpoena, they can call people in, and they can collect evidence, which they can do by law, which we cannot do. I remember of a specific incident that was related to me in a church where apparently in the men's bathroom, somebody was taking older gentlemen pictures of younger boys. And so the deacons confronted the individual, and when they looked at the cell phone, there was no evidence of the pictures, and everybody was happy. In my mind, I said, no, your job was not to investigate it. You had to report that incident, because the appropriate officials would have been able to collect that cell phone, and through their forensic work, they would have been able to say where the pictures were actually deleted. And only at the end of that investigation would somebody be able to determine, say, well, abuse did take place or didn't take place according to the definitions and the Act. So we must be very, very careful to assume the role of investigation, which firstly, we do not have the authority, we do not have the capacity, and we're not trained to do the investigation. There's another element, especially in dealing with child sexual abuse, and that is so-called contamination of evidence. So inexperienced parents, they will often ask the child, is your tummy aching? The child will say, yes. Okay, so we tick that one, tummy is aching. Is your head aching? Yes, my head is aching. So the answer to every question is yes. And often a child sort of suspects or assumes that this is the answer that you want, and they will give that answer. And so if you ask the child, did the uncle do this or this? You'll say yes. Did the uncle do this or this? The child will say yes. And so people who deal with this, and especially your first respondents, have a very specific way of collecting that incidents and report that initial conversation. It becomes crucial, because if you do it wrongly, innocent people can actually be accused. And if you do it wrongly, guilty people can actually walk. And so investigation is a skill. There's a lot of dangers and pitfalls in there, but our duty is not to investigate. Our duty is to report. And then we leave it and we live with the investigation that has been done, because it's not our duty. And I think that's important for us to understand, especially at church level. Then the APC, the Abuse Prevention Committee, must assist the church leadership in responding appropriately to report of the abuse. And if you put it out graphically, it will look something like this. We are aware of the abuse. You immediately inform the APO, the abuse prevention official. The abuse prevention official will assist you in reporting to the relevant authorities. So some must go to a social worker, other must go to directly to the police, whatever the case might be. And then the APC, the Abuse Prevention Committee, is activated so that proper record keeping can take place, there's a proper paper trail, and that we can do the necessary. In certain cases, it might be necessary to activate the precautionary removal or suspension of an officer. I'll deal with that policy a little bit later. If you are accused of any of these abuses listed in the policy, then that individual need to step down while they wait the outcome of the investigation. And if the person doesn't step down, then it's on the duty of the church to actually remove the person precautionarily for the duration. We can talk about that a little bit later. So we've already said that all entities must appoint or designate an APO. And we've talked about the committee and what they are doing. And so the functions of the APC, I think we started, I want to go to the actual functions of the APO. So what does the APO or the abuse prevention official do? Myself in this case is to make all current and newly appointed and elected employees aware of the contents of this policy and the identity of the APO. And I think that's the reason why Pastor has requested this meeting, so that you can know that I'm the abuse prevention official for Helderberg Church, and that we expose you to some of the policy and some of the matters relating to this. So it says all appointed or newly elected employees, and in our case officers, because we don't pay the church officers, to receive all reports described in terms of this policy. In other words, if you are aware of an incident, there's a specific report. We'll refer to Form 22 that needs to be filled in. And so if you are aware, we'll request that you fill it in. We'll make that form available. It will be at myself. We'll make sure that Pastor has a copy of that. And we'll also give a copy to the church secretary, so that if you need a copy of that, that you do have a copy of that report. And then what do we do with that report? To ensure that all reportable incidents are properly and effectively reported in terms of this policy and or in terms of all other reporting standard. To ensure that proper records are kept of the reported incidents and the outcome thereof. The APO is further responsible to be reasonable and advisable to provide, of course, to provide ministerial care to all the parties involved in a reportable incident. So it looks like this will also become a function of the APC or the Abuse Prevention Committee. And it's normally not wise to be, in law, in legislation or in legal terms, they distinguish between what they call forensic involvement or therapy, and also then your more curative or therapy, clinical therapy, where they will work with healing and restoration, and you normally don't ask the same person. So when I'm involved in the reporting of the incidents, you deal with the victim and you deal with the alleged perpetrator, then it's normally not wise to continue in that function. But fortunately, we are a church. We have more resources, and so you will designate other people to facilitate in that role, as to not conflict or to contaminate the process. The APO must provide or cause to be provided abuse identification, intervention, and prevention training to employees, and especially to those who work with the vulnerable at organizational and local church level. And again, when it refers to employees, our understanding is at local level, we adapt because it's union policy. They've got employees at local church where the same policy applies. We have volunteers or elected church officials, and the same would apply at our level. The seventh function, the APO will take reasonable care that the integrity of any investigative process, criminal or civil, or the reporting of any incident in accordance with this policy are not jeopardized or interfered with or obstructed in by any person or committee. And sometimes we find in churches that church boards take the liberty, and they think that they can decide that we don't need to report this, or that child sexual abuse didn't take place. Remember, that would be then assuming a role or a duty that was never given to you in the first place. Firstly, you don't have the capacity, you're not trained for that process, and you don't have all the facts to make that determination to start off with. According to legislation, we need to report and we act on the report that we receive from that perspective. That this policy are not jeopardized or interfered with or obstructed by any person or committee when suspecting that a person or committee is of the intention to jeopardize in any manner, obstruct or interfere with the aforementioned investigative or reportive processes. The APO must immediately report such suspicion to the South African Police Services. And again, being church, sometimes small churches where the person might be even the first elder and the person might be the accused in the particular case. One can see with conflict of interest, the individual could try and prevent the investigation. And it's in cases like that, or in similar situations where this part of the policy will speak to say we should ensure that nobody stops or prevents the investigation. So, summary, or the Abuse Prevention Committee. All entities must appoint such a committee. The membership is all heads of departments dealing with vulnerable groups. The function of the APC or the Abuse Prevention Committee is to assist the abuse prevention official with his or her functions and duties, and the chairperson of such a committee or the Abuse Prevention Committee would be the abuse prevention official appointed by the congregation. So that's in short just the process from the start to going through. Let me take Pastor's hand. He's got special grace. The others I'll take later.
We've got 8 minutes before the next. So it's possible to maybe wrap up the live stream. Like we to continue afterwards. Even just part 1 for the online.
Okay, I think we'll try and regain this 30 seconds, but I'm aiming very hard to try and then, because we only left with the policy with the document. So because of that, let me not spend too much time with Matthew 18, because the question is often asked, when we get to disciplinary processes and when we get to matters like this, what about Matthew 18? And let me just say in short that compliance to this policy doesn't negate Matthew 18 principle and the counsels of Ellen White on the principles of church discipline. But the vulnerable person abuse prevention policy address criminal behavior. And Matthew 18 addresses church discipline process and not criminal behavior. I hope that's clear. It's very different processes that are followed. And so one cannot say, well, we're still busy with Matthew 18 and hence we didn't report it. I can assure you that the judge will frown on that and that he will, if found that you deliberately delayed the process, that section 54 of the Criminal Act could kick in with a fine or criminal imprisonment up to 5 years. So Matthew 18 will not help you there. And maybe it's a little bit tongue in the cheek, but we live in a secular society. And when the courts are making rulings, they are less favorable when churches are involved. And so when the church is on the accusing side or the other side, they tend to not go with the religious organization or with religious sentiment. That's our belief. They don't see it like that. So be very, very careful to say, well, we didn't comply because of Matthew 18. And again, I'm not saying that Matthew 18 and the counsels of Ellen White is not important, but they were intended for very different purposes than this act and this policy is intended. So the policy 530 discusses reporting method and procedure. A report in terms of this policy must be made in the prescribed format, and the prescribed format is Form 22, which we will deal with a little bit later. It says a report of child sexual abuse, pornography, deliberate neglect or physical abuse must be done by completing the applicable form, such as Form 22. We will try and explain to you that Form 22. The reporting of abuse or deliberate neglect of a child in South Africa or any other format is described by the government. The aforementioned form can be obtained from your local APO. We are only aware of Form 22. That's the standard form that we use. It says the copy of the completed form must be forwarded to the APO. The APO must assist the reporter to successfully report the alleged offence. Both the reporter and the APO must keep records of the report and specifically the date, time, and person to whom the report was made. And this is very important for records. When it gets to matters like this, it's not something that you're going to report today and there will be a conclusion within a week or two. I've been involved with some of these matters that has extended over years. And sometimes you report the matter and you could find yourself, because it goes through various courts and you could find yourself being asked to give an account in a high court 5, 6, 7 years later. You can't recall, and so that's why it's very helpful to make sure that you have records and that you keep the records as far as this is concerned. I'm not going to deal too much with this specific one. I'm watching the time, and I would like to actually get to the form before load shedding catches up with us. But you can read all of this in the policy. Just this is very, very important. If you report it, you must ensure that the case number or the events register number be provided. You must insist, you must not leave the police station until they give you a piece of paper, they put the police stamp on and say, this is the date, the time that you were here. And my counsel will be, take somebody with you that can testify that you were actually at the police station and that you made the report. Okay. The church has a prevention mechanisms. I'm not going to spend too much with this. There's a 2-adult policy, which means never be alone with a child. There's an open door policy, which means whenever you are in a room with children, that you never alone, just myself as the pastor with a child, and the door is closed. By the way, that's one of the reasons when the church built the pastor's office many, many years ago. You will see there's a huge window in that, for that reason, that you would never be alone when you do counseling or you work with people. In other words, to protect you. You can be private, but not alone. And I think that's the key. Then there's the volunteer screening. The police will issue a police clearance certificate. There's challenges with this. It's only, I think, applicable for 3 or 6 months. I can't recall now exactly, but it's not forever. And it's fairly costly. So one need to see about that. But that's the clearance that we are aware of, or the screening that can take place. Then there's the 6-month policy, which means that we should not appoint new people who join the church before they are at least 6 months part of the congregation, especially if they work with the vulnerable, the elderly, or when they work with children. Training and precautionary removal is then also some of the mechanisms indicated. And so let me just focus quickly on this precautionary removal. It says, local church leaders accused of any form of abusive conduct contained in the policy must, as a precautionary measure, temporarily step down from all positions of trust or any position that allows him or her contact with children or vulnerable people until such time as the allegations has been disproved. You see? And it's very important that we sort of stick to this. We get into all sorts of legal technicalities if we don't. The responsibilities shall include, but not limited to, the following. If you are leading out in worship, preaching, teaching, representing the church, if you're a Sabbath school leader. So if you are accused, the best is to step down until your name is cleared, according to this policy. And if the person doesn't want to step down until his or her name is cleared, then the board will have a duty to precautionary remove the person until the air is cleared. It speaks about discipline, more particular to church employees, that if we do not follow, if the pastor is not ensuring that this policy is implemented, he can face discipline and even lose his job if it gets to that. So let me not spend too much time about that unhappy topic right now. Let me try and see if we can talk about Form 22 quickly. We'll make it available, but I just want to expose you to the form itself. And this is the form. On the form itself, it will say it's reporting of abuse or deliberate neglect of a child, Regulation 33, Section 110 of the Children's Act, 38 of 2005. This is a form used by social workers. They've got statutory framework in which they operate with children, and this is the form that they use. It's a 5-page form. I know you can't read that, but we'll zoom into it right now. And it's a fairly comprehensive form that needs to be completed and that needs to be submitted. So we'll make that form available. And so basically the form will deal with the various detail. Let me see if we can focus on some of it. So the person, let me just see if I can get my, yes, no, it looks like I can't get the laser to speak with the screen, but it's fine. So sort of there under the bottom section, you indicate the source of the report, whether you are the victim reporting it, whether you're a relative or your parent, whether you're a neighborhood friend, whether you're a professional, other capacity. So if you're a church member, you'll probably indicate that. Then details of the child needs to be completed there. Gender, date of birth, things like that. And then the category of care of the child, you'll fill it in there if it's applicable in that particular case. And then other interventions, it's a contact person trusted by the child. So sometimes the abuser would be parents or close family relatives, and the child has a different person whom they trust, then you will indicate it in there. And then you will indicate whether you interviewed other children or other witnesses. We're not recommending too much investigating take place, as we've indicated already, and because of the contamination that can take place. So if you act on a reasonable report that has been made to you in good faith, that is good enough. It is easier for them to come back and say nothing happened than when you have to go back and explain why you allowed a child to be abused and you did nothing about it. That is very, very sad. And it happens too many times, even in our own denomination, that children attempts to make reports of abuse and somehow they're not heard. They report it to church officers, they report it to social workers. I've been dealing or been involved with the matter somewhere in our area about 2-3 years ago, and the child reported this matter to at least 2 social workers who did not hear the child, several church members. And so we were dealing with the matter 4 or 5 years later. The additional trauma and pain caused to the child could have been prevented if the first responder just reported the matter and intervened and allowed the child or protected the child from that. So then the details of the child will be in there. If you have details of the alleged abuser, you will indicate it in the next portion of. Sometimes we have that information, sometimes we don't have that information. The parents of the child might be different than the above, and so you will indicate that in the next section of the form, dealing with the specifics there. And then the actual abuse, the specifics of the abuse and how it relates will be narrated in this part of the report. And then the emotional impact or the abuse, or whether it's sexual or deliberate neglect, you will indicate that appropriate section on the form. And then if any medical intervention was done, sometimes the injuries of such nature that the child is taken to a medical practitioner, and so there would be reports, and so all of that is also recorded in. And then whether the matter has been reported to the police, the police case number, if a case is open. In our case, we don't report the matter to open a case. We don't open a case. We report the matter as per the mandatory or the statutory requirements of the various legislation. So in our case, they won't give you a case number, but they have what they call the incident book. and that incident book or IB reference register is what you need. So the police station, the telephone number. Please make sure that you have the name of the person who you speak to and the rank of that officer, so that you can refer back to that. But make sure that you get some physical evidence that you were there from the police station. But so some of these details we fill in. So we will normally fill this form in before we go to the police station, and we will just include this last section. And then there's more information about the welfare organizations and social developments, if that is applicable in the case. And then lastly, you will fill in the